This morning, before we hear the second lesson, I want to invite all of you into a posture of prayer, of encountering a different way of feeling the scripture. So I invite you to sit up in your seats, to spread your legs so that they are in line with your hips, so that you are open, and pull your shoulders back, allowing yourself to be open to the Word of God. In the 24th chapter of Luke, verses 13 through 16 and 28 through 32. Now, it was on the same day, two of them were going to the village called Emmaus, about 8 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all of the things that had just happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. As they came near the village to which they were going, he began to walk ahead, as if he was going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread. He broke it and shared it with them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And then he vanished. They said to each other, "Were our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road? While he opened up the scriptures to all of us?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. At the age of 60, Keith Short was in the middle of his routine workout of lifting weights, walking and running 3 miles on the treadmill. As he was finishing, he felt a sudden pain in his chest. Maybe I pulled a muscle, he thought. He finished his workout, but the symptoms only continued to get worse. What he should have done was call 911 immediately. Instead, what he did was to get into his truck and drive 1.5 miles home. With his symptoms getting worse and the pain and the sweat continuing to increase, his wife took over and drove them about 5 miles to the closest hospital. When they entered the ER, the medical staff rushed him to a room and onto a bed. They began to give him medication and did an EKG. And then eventually, Keith was life-flighted to another hospital that was more equipped to care for him. It might be fitting that this morning we're hearing, on the last Sunday of Ordinary Time, we are hearing an Easter story. In the midst of the extended, dreary days of winter that seem to stretch on and on, we begin to look for the signs of spring. The daylight hours extending, the tulips and crocus and daffodils emerging from the frozen earth. This morning we hear a story that gives us hope for what is to come. For the past number of weeks, we have heard about Paul's trials and tribulations, and we've heard about how the early adopters of this new way of living, about following Christ, how incredibly difficult that was to do. Not much different from the conversations we are having in the church today. Yet, this morning we come back to a Jesus story, a resurrection story no less, which reveals the power and mystery of God, the God who encounters people in the middle of their journey, in the middle of their ordinary lives. We are hearing a story once again where God reminds us that no matter what we do, no matter how far we stray, God is still present, even if we have no idea that God is there. This morning we encounter the story of two disciples Now, scholars suppose that these two disciples were married because in the text, one is named and one stays anonymous. And in that time and culture, in this embedded story, that would typically indicate the presence of a woman, a person who is not named. We can also safely assume that because they are walking together, that they are married. That would be the only situation in which a woman and a man would be seen walking together. Now, these two disciples are venturing out of the safety and seclusion of the other disciples as they begin to walk the 8-mile road to Emmaus, a 3-hour journey. And that is when they encounter Christ. Keith, in the middle of his cardiac event, landed at the next hospital, all alone. He was rushed from the helicopter into a waiting cath lab where the medical team found that his left anterior descending artery, the one that the doctors call the widowmaker, was 99% blocked. We encounter the disciples alone, walking to Emmaus in the midst of their own spiritual heart attack. They are so wrapped up in the stuff that led up to this moment, the abandonment, the torture, the execution, and now the body of Jesus missing, presumed stolen from the tomb that they had just put him in 3 days before. Wrapped up in their own emotions of fear and anxiety and anger, they are so distracted that they cannot see the face of Christ in the stranger that they encounter along their route. 3 weeks ago, sitting in the Heinz Spiritual Center in downtown Houston, I realized that I was one of those disciples, someone who was so wrapped up in my own emotions that I failed to see God standing right in front of me, leading me forward. In the middle of my path, I realized that I was having a spiritual heart attack. In the anxiety of our present moment here at Church of the Covenant, and in the busyness of my life, I was not focused on my why. Each of us have a why. It is the thing that gives each of us energy and purpose. It is the thing that gives life and fuels our partnership with God in God's dream. Each of us have two hearts. We have our anatomical heart that lives in our thoracic cavity, providing the life-giving rhythm of blood, pumping throughout our body. The other heart, our spiritual heart, lives deep within the core of our being. And this heart is priming the essence of who we are to our core. Our spiritual heart is our why. It's what Marcus Borg calls the womb of creation. It is where our creativity, compassion, hope, and justice lives until we breathe it into life. When we get too focused on all the other things instead of our why, we risk damaging our spiritual heart. We put ourselves at risk for a spiritual heart attack. And there I was, in the midst of a profound spiritual event. Instead of focusing on the core essence of myself, the things that called me to religious life, the things that called me to covenant, the things that call me into partnership with God and give me life, I was so focused on all the other stuff, the who, the what, the where, the when, the how, the because, that I had put myself in risk of spiritual death. I was having an Emmaus moment where I could not see God with me. Have you ever been so focused on something that you couldn't see God, that you lost your why? Are we a faith community who is so focused right now on emotions of fear and anger and anxiety and apathy that we have forgot to see the face of Christ in the person sitting right next to us? Are we having an Emmaus moment? If this is our Emmaus moment and we and the church are having a spiritual heart attack, are we feeling the pain and suffering that it brings? Today, as we take time to pray and meditate and listen to music, let us take stock of where we are. Let us assess our spiritual health using the diagram on the wonder sheet that is in your bulletin and fill in the arteries that might be blocked by the stuff in your life, the stuff that is preventing you from living into God's dream right now. And take the opportunity to name your why, to say what gives you life, what gives you purpose, what makes you you. At the second hospital, the medical team performed a cardiac intervention, placing a stent to restore the blood flow from Keith's heart. But they could not undo the damage that had been done. His doctor told him he was lucky to be alive. In the midst of our own spiritual heart attack, God is calling us like Jesus called those disciples on the Emmaus Road, to slow down, to be in holy conversation with one another, and to widen the circle larger and larger. God is inviting us to sit at table with people who we do not know, and even those we do not like, and to share the stories of our common humanity. God's intervention is not a passive suggestion of what we should do, but it's an active call, a call to ministry with this community, a call that promotes a way forward instead of secluding ourselves within suffering and pain. It's a call to follow Jesus' ministry that was equipping everyone to encounter God's love in the midst of systems of exclusion and power. The gospel that Jesus promotes only widens the circle of inclusion and provides abundantly for everyone. Now is the time for us to intervene and prevent the damage to the heart of this community. Our why is not about how big of an endowment we have, the building we occupy, the music we experience, and even the preaching we hear. The why does not exist in the staff or in who is in leadership. Our why is the essence of this community. It is the tangible encounter for others with the radical message of God's unwavering love. We will refine our why when we come together in honest and loving relationships with one another, when we affirm each other's gifts instead of sabotaging their efforts. Restoring the heart of this community will require us to enter into hard and uncomfortable conversations with ourselves and with one another. It will mean using the wisdom gained from our tradition and our past to inform and innovate our future. It will mean taking the risk of confronting old problems in new ways with open eyes and hearts and minds. It will widen the circle so everyone is included and every voice is heard. Returning home, probably like many others who have had a major heart attack, Keith was facing a new normal. The day after getting out of the hospital, he began walking, not a long distance, just down the street and back, and that completely exhausted him. "Is this going to be the new me?" cried Keith. Keith's walks continued, a little further each time and eventually increasing them to 3 and then 4 miles. Not quickly, but he did it. Keith did the work he needed to do to start a new life. Each and every day, we encounter God not as a supernatural being removed from us and the universe, but as an ever-present spirit and source of wisdom along our journey. We encounter God, a guide that breaks into our lives no matter what we are focused on, no matter the depth of our despair, and a God that restores us into new and flourishing life. God is here, living in the womb of our being, providing the steady and ever-present rhythm of our lives. When we slow down, when we pause from the chaos and noise, when we sit at table to break bread and share the cup with our neighbors, Christ, the God of compassion, the God of justice, is sitting right next to us and revealing to us that God has been there the whole time. A God who is sitting there, holding us accountable for our actions, affirming our gifts, and helping us to dream the dreams we cannot dream ourselves. God has been there, burning in our hearts. Amen.